Lois Lane is a part of the Superman universe, is one of the most iconic comic book characters of all time. Clearly a household name character. She's been played by more than a dozen female actresses in live action. My favorite versions have been Margot Kidder in the Christopher Reeve Superman movies, Terry Hatcher in Lois and Clark, and Amy Adams in the Snyderverse. The character even headlined her own title in the Silver Age and Bronze Age of comics. And one of the most controversial and interesting issues of this series ever was Superman's Girlfriend Lois Lane, issue 106, released in 1970, in which Lois Lane is transformed into a black woman and intermingles with the black community for one day. Is it silly? Yes. Is it cringe by today's standards? Yes. Is it worth revisiting this story 53 years after it was first published? Also yes, and I'm going to go over this page for page. It'll be a summary and some quick quotes to make this go by faster. But first, I will allow you 10 seconds to get your outrage or your jokes in right now, and I'll do that through the following memes that I'm listing right now. Alright, let's get right into it. It starts out with Lois Lane telling Clark Kent that she's got the assignment of her life, where she's going to do a report on the black slums of Metropolis called Little Africa. Yes, the black section of Metropolis is called Little Africa. Just go with it. So she takes a cab down to Little Africa. I'm already laughing. So she introduces herself as a reporter from the Daily Planet and tries to talk to some school-age children, and they turn their back on her. And this response from the children seems to startle her. And then the next page it says, entering a nearby slum tenement. In other words, she's in the hood, like really deep hood. And she's like knocking on doors saying, if the kids won't talk to me, maybe an adult will. I mean, seriously, she's a white woman in an impoverished black neighborhood that's randomly knocking on doors, being nosy, and she's wondering why people are slamming their door at her. And she's thinking to herself, how can I break through this wall of suspicion? And no one will talk to her. I mean, even the baby looks like she's mad at her. So yes, this is supposed to be a dramatic story, but it's coming off as unintentional comedy. And then it says, wandering like a homeless ghost. And she sits down on a park bench next to a blind woman and starts talking to her, and the blind woman gets up and walks away, and Lois suspects that by the sound of her voice, the woman knew that she was white and walked away. So poor Lois Lane keeps walking through the neighborhood, and a community organizer spots her and says, look at her, brothers and sisters. She's young and sweet and pretty, but never forget, she's whitey. Wow. Yeah, definitely more cringe dialogue. Let me remind you again, this was written in 1970 by white people, imagining what they think black people sound like, and of course they don't quite get it right. This was written by a man named Robert Kanigher, who wrote comics all through the Golden and Silver Age. Just a little historical context. Now back to our story. And by the way, describing a woman as young, sweet, and pretty sounds like you like her. Doesn't sound like you hate her, does it? A little jungle fever, maybe? Alright, this is where things go from funny to weird. Where Superman flies in and says, Clark told me about your assignment. How's it going? And she cries and whines and says, like nothing, Superman. I've drawn a blank. I'll never get inside Little Africa unless you help me. So he flies her to his Fortress of Solitude, which is described as being in the Arctic. And this is where we have a plot hole because it's pretty cold there and she's still wearing this little mini skirt. But the whole premise of this comic is ridiculous, so let's go ahead and continue. So he puts her in a special plaster mold and asks, do you really want to do this? She's like, I do. I've used the machine before. Go ahead. So Superman pulls the lever and it goes whum, and Lois Lane turns into a black woman. Wow, Superman actually did. I mean, Kryptonians just have these race-changing machines just laying around, right? I mean, they could come in handy. What if Obama had one? Would Republicans been so mad at him if he looked like this? Now back to our story, and now Lois Lane is now a black woman. And Superman warns her that the change is going to last only for about a day, and then she'll change to white again. And she's like, okay, that's fine. Just fly me back so I can change my clothes. So no, she can't just be black. She has to dress black too, right? And remember, this story predates Tropic Thunder by 38 years, where Robert Downey Jr.'s character in that movie turns into a black man and goes into character just a little bit too deeply. That movie is very funny, but very controversial for a reason. Now let's move on. And now Lois Lane, now looking and dressing like a black woman, tries to go back to Little Africa. And she tries to hail a cab, but the cab driver drives right by her and picks up a white person. And she's like, this is my first lesson in the meaning of being black. She can't get a cab, so she decides to take the subway. She enters an apartment building and sees some garbage on fire and puts it out. One of the women that lives there invites her into her apartment and explains to Lois that the slumlord says he can't afford a janitor. Explains that this place is a fire trap. Yeah. And the woman asks her if she wants some coffee. And falling plaster falls into Lois's coffee. And a large rat scares the toddler of the other woman. And Black Lois starts to cry a little bit and thinks about how this woman lives in misery. And by the way, here's an ad in this comic for some toy vehicles. Looks like something out of a Mad Max movie, but it predates that by 10 years. She runs across the community organizer again, who's hosting an improvised pre-kindergarten. He's telling the kids that black is beautiful. Haven't I seen you somewhere before? It may sound like a line, but I think I have. And Lois stumbles and says, And then he notices some teenage kids going into an alley saying, hey, they should be in school. And he tells her to stay put and he's going to investigate because this is man's business. Remember, this comic is an anti-racist story. It didn't say anything about sexism. In 1970, sexism is just Tuesday. So the community organizer runs into the alley to see what's going on, and Black Lois decides to come as well. And it appears that the kids are doing a shady deal with some mobsters, and the mobsters think that the organizer is plainclothes fuzz. The word fuzz is a slang term for the police back then. You might call them the pigs, 5-0, one time, whatever you call the cops. So they think he's the cop, so they shoot him. And of course, Superman shows up, who clearly does not trust the judgment of Lois Lane. He's had to save her 150 million times in the last 80 years, and melts the guns of the mobsters. It makes quick work of them, and then flies Lois and the community organizer to a hospital. And the man who got shot is going to need a blood transfusion, but he has O negative blood. But this is an underfunded inner city hospital, and they don't have O negative blood. But of course, Lois Lane has O negative blood. That's not coincidence. That's called plot convenience. A situation where something happens in the plot in an unnatural manner that can also be manipulated and used as a way to advance the development of a story. And this is the textbook definition of plot convenience. So Lois goes through with the transfusion and it saves the life of the community organizer. He wakes up from being unconscious and he sees that Black Lois has saved his life. But the story takes a controversial turn as it says that Lois meets Superman 30 minutes later and confronts him with a tough question. And she asks him point blank, look me straight in the eye and tell me the truth. Do you love me? Suppose I couldn't change back. Would you marry me? Even if I'm black, I'm an outsider in a white man's world. Oh, I got my popcorn ready for this one. How does Superman respond to this question? Superman is about truth, justice, in the American way. He responds like a hero, correct? No, he actually deflects and comes up very small. Check out this tap dancing. You asked that of me? Superman, an alien from Krypton, another planet, a universal soldier. I don't even have human skin. It's tougher than steel. And Black Lois is like, yeah, bruh, but your skin is the right color. Come on, Superman, you gotta do better than that. But Superman keeps on deflecting and says, you know I couldn't risk placing you in deadly danger from my foes. They'd try to hurt me by killing you. And Black Lois says, I've heard that same song before, Superman. Do you always have to play the same broken record when I mention marriage? Listen, hey Superman, can you stop playing dodgeball and just answer the question? The answer is he doesn't. Well, we get another plot convenience bailout because Lois turns back to white and Superman says, yes Lois, you're white again. The effect didn't last as long as I expected. So this changes the subject and Superman's like, whew, dodge that. Kal-El, we're disappointed in you, man. The nurse tells Lois that the patient wants to see her. Now, of course, she's turned back white now. Of course, she confides in Superman that, he called me whitey earlier. What will he say now knowing that I'm white? Superman's like, well, yeah, you gotta see him because if he still hates you with your blood in his veins, there may never be peace in this world. That's not very well written. What the heck? The final page has no dialogue, and Lois, who is now white again, reveals herself to the community organizer whose life she just saved. At first he's startled, but then he smiles and he hands out his hand and they shake on it, which is supposed to be a symbol for racial unity, and the story ends. There's a lot to digest here in this story. From Lois Lane issue 106 from 1970 from DC Comics titled I Am Curious Black, where with the help of Superman, Lois Lane turns into a black woman for a day to investigate the black community in Metropolis called Little Africa. And everyone learns a lesson like it's a after-school special. It's a very cringe-worthy story by today's standards, but just remember it's a product of its time, released in 1970. It was written by white men who don't always get it right on how black people talk, think, act, and live. But I commend them for trying to make a story of racial unity in a comic book, as America was just coming out of legal segregation and moving towards its promise that all men are created equal. I do want to point out again that they made Superman fail miserably, and that Black Lois asked him, would you marry me if I was black, and stayed black, and Superman only tap danced around that issue. For some reason, he couldn't give a definitive yes or no. So to me, that means no, Superman was not into black chicks. Considering that Superman isn't really white himself, he just looks white. He's an alien from another planet. That doesn't seem to make sense to me. But at the end of the day, I'm not too hard on the story. I thought it was worth looking at and sharing with my audience. Tell me what you think about it in the comment section, because there's a lot to unpack here. This is my first video back since the death of my brother. I just want to recognize him. He was the person who got me into comics. Rest in peace, Albert Jackson Jr., 1966 to 2023. Rest in peace, you will be missed. While you're here, be sure to check out one of my previous videos where I discuss racial swaps in live action comic book movies. Of course, it's a very controversial subject that we'll be discussing years to come. In this video, I attempt to have a good faith argument about it. Until next time, this is Comic Killer 72 for Comic Power saying bye-bye.